Strody 1. A few years ago, on a snowy February day, something amazing happened on the road from Moscow to Penza along the M5 highway. To this day, there is no logical explanation for what happened that night. When the hands of a clock approached midnight, I left the Moscow Ring Road, hoping to return home at 9 o'clock in the morning. I drove Penny with an empty trailer. I was not alone. I was with my wife. Before the trip, the car was fine. Having ridden it for over a year, I checked everything I needed. But when I got to the track, I realized that something was wrong. After midnight, the Lada ceased to function normally. It gives the impression that you are driving a loaded truck. Riding in first gear is almost impossible on small, unobtrusive hills. After that, stopped the car several times in a bright place and check. Couldn't determine why. The trailer moved freely, and the engine rotated smoothly at all speeds. But the car could barely move. The distance to Kalama is about 110 kilometers, but it took us 3 hours. Previously, this distance was overcome in less than 2 hours, so I regretted not being home until 10 a.m., refueling at a gas station on the outskirts of Kalama. Before that, I was pretty exhausted after 3 hours of turtle driving on a dark highway. I had two options. You can continue to crawl through the darkness of the night, or wait for the gas station to open and take a nap in your cabin for a few hours. It was cold, the air was cool and fresh, the cabin was cozy and warm, the stove worked well, and the music was quiet. My wife and I talked over hot coffee and decided to move on. Slowly but still, we approached the house. It was several hours of travel. Before leaving, I prayed in my heart and asked God for help, and apparently my prayers were answered. The car was fast, light, and free to drive. But a new obstacle arose, a snowdrift across the road. It was dark at night. The headlights could not see the roadway through the thick white veil of rustic sour cream. After a few kilometers, we stopped in amazement, and my heart began to beat. No, I didn't have body hair, but I had a lump in my throat. As I got out of the car and set off on my journey, I froze for a moment. Midnight, 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 midnight? I stood shaking my head, rubbing my eyes and stroking my cheeks. No, I don't represent anything. On the sign in front of me, it was written that we were entering the Penza region, but it's unrealistic. I found myself driving over 300 kilometers in just a few minutes. I stood there digesting what had happened, but could not find an explanation for what had happened. Since then, I have been very impressed. We passed the Penza region without incident. When the coin stopped near the house, the clock showed 5:30 instead of 9 o'clock. The distance from Kalama to Penza is 530 kilometers. Travel time is 2 hours 30 minutes. However, this is only possible if you are driving a sports car at 230 kilometers/8 or more, and not a penny on snowy roads. At the same time, only half gas was available. Even taking into account the slow travel to Kalama, I found that I drove 650 kilometers from Moscow to Penza in 5.5 hours instead of 8.5 hours. In the 90s, I never drove a Kopeka more than 90 kilometers/8. Kopeka had a tank with a capacity of 40 liters, drove 530 kilometers, but used only half. And this is evidenced by the fact that he calmly moved by car from Kalama to the Penza region. I still don't understand what happened to us that night. Story 2. This happened about 5 years ago, when I worked as a courier and carried a parcel to another city. I will never forget that November night and the face and eyes of a stranger who was sitting in my car at that time. I drove on the highway for 4 hours. Oddly enough, there was no oncoming traffic that day. It was only 10 to 15 km to the city. I called ahead and booked a room at a local hotel. I was so tired and struggling with drowsiness that I dreamed of getting to the hotel as soon as possible and jumping into the comfortable, soft bed in my room. It was completely dark, with only distant headlights illuminating the bumpy road. I lit a cigarette and opened the window a little. It was very cold outside, and the windshield was covered with fine snow, which further worsened visibility. Finishing my cigarette, I put my left hand through the gap between the glass and the door and saw a waving figure at the side of the road. I turned off the lights in the car so he could see better. Was a man, what was he doing here? I thought. He slowed down to 40 kilometers/h and quietly began to approach. Riding in the cold wind and frowning, the stranger continued to wave his hand. Two thoughts came to my mind. Firstly, passers-by are dangerous people like bandits. What is he doing in the middle of the night? I screamed. I leave at my own risk. The figure slowly began to approach the car. After locking all the doors, I opened the passenger side window. Who are you and what are you doing here? I didn't have an answer. When I turned on the light in the cabin, I saw his face. It was the pale face of an old man. The pupils were barely visible under the whites. Excuse me, could you pick me up? Finally, the stranger spoke up. I won't go far. Are you going to the city? No, it's closer. And if you are a fugitive or a bandit? No, I'm a lost and unhappy person. I opened the door and put him in the car. Anyway, if you're not going to the city, where are you going? Don't worry, good man, I need to get out after a few kilometers. I panicked a little and went through the options in my head. What's in those few kilometers? House, hut, like what? Are you waiting for your friend to push an asshole like me away? What is your name? Asked the old man suddenly. Born, he whispered. And my name is Oleg Ivanovich, he answered. Well, let's find out, the stranger crowed. We drove in silence for the remaining 5 minutes when suddenly Mr. Trump said, Stop here. I was very surprised, but there was nothing nearby. Black highways and dark forests, and only roadside benches reflected in the headlights. Well, thank you, Kostya. The old man barely began to rise from the passenger seat. Please, Oleg Ivanovich, I muttered. When I closed the door, I began to see strange satellites. They froze on the same bench and took awkward steps. What is he doing and why is he not going anywhere? I got tired of looking at him and left as soon as I could. I arrived at the hotel in the morning. The situation repeated itself in my head. Without undressing, I collapsed on the bed and slept until 1 in the morning. I was awakened by a phone call. On the other side was my companion Valera. I told him all about my strange man. You're crazy. He was indignant. Maybe you're just lucky to be alive. Arrival at the base, baggage check-in and departure. I safely left my luggage, had a good rest in my room and went home. The bumpy and steep road was clearly visible during the day. Suddenly, my attention turned to the bench I saw yesterday. I slowly stopped at the curb and continued to think about whether I should get out. But I got out. I was wondering where he went. I continued to think. Oleg Ivanovich. He called himself. Back in the car, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dusty wreath on a pole, next to the bench, and the inscription in the column reads, Nikiforov Oleg Ivanovich and life, 1930 to 2005. I felt cramps. Cold ran down my spine. I jumped into the car and accelerated. I haven't driven that truck since.